Smoke drifts low over the water, thick enough to sting the eyes, heavy enough to blur the edges of the city. Tenochtitlán is no longer a place of songs and drums. It is a place of hunger, shattered stone, and silence broken only by distant shouting. The lake that once protected the city now carries bodies. On the causeways, broken shields lie beside abandoned sandals. At the center of it all stands the last ruler of the Mexica, Cuauhtémoc, watching the city that fed millions collapse into ruin. The sun rises over temples already burning, and the question hangs in the air, heavier than the smoke itself. How did they come to this moment, surrounded by water yet dying of thirst, ruling an empire yet reduced to desperation? This city was once the largest urban center in the Americas, home to more people than London or Paris at the same time. Its streets were cleaner than most European capitals. Food arrived daily by canoe in quantities that could feed entire nations. Yet now, the water is undrinkable, poisoned by bodies and debris. People chew leather, bark, and mud mixed with algae just to quiet the pain in their stomachs. Disease moves faster than soldiers ever could, killing emperors before battles are finished. An empire that ruled millions falls in less than 2 years, undone not just by steel and gunpowder, but by alliances, fear, and a microscopic enemy no one could see. The final battle is loud, but the reasons for it stretch far back into silence. Before the fire, before the horses, before the floating bridges of war, there was a people who believed the world itself could end if they failed their duties. They believed the sun demanded nourishment to keep moving across the sky. They believed humans existed on borrowed time, living under the shadow of past worlds that had already been destroyed. This belief shaped everything they built, every war they fought, and every sacrifice they made. And it raises a quiet, unsettling thought. If you truly believed the universe would collapse without your action, what would you be willing to do to stop it? The Mexica did not begin as emperors. They arrived late to the Valley of Mexico, unwanted and mocked, forced to live on the margins of more powerful city-states. Other peoples saw them as crude, dangerous, and desperate. They were given land no one else wanted, a swampy island in the middle of a shallow lake. It was supposed to be a slow death. Instead, it became the foundation of one of the most complex civilizations the world has ever known. Survival taught them discipline. Hunger taught them innovation. Exile taught them unity. Their city rose from mud and reeds. Artificial islands were built by hand, layered with soil dredged from the lake bottom, creating floating farms called chinampas. These farms produced multiple harvests a year, feeding a population that grew faster than anyone thought possible. Fresh water flowed through aqueducts engineered with remarkable precision. Waste was removed daily. Public markets operated with strict rules and judges to enforce fairness. In one of these markets, tens of thousands gathered each day, trading cacao, feathers, obsidian, cloth, and food. Counterfeit goods were punished severely. Order was not optional. It was survival. At the center of this system stood the emperor, not merely a king, but a figure bound by ritual, law, and cosmic responsibility. His clothing marked him as sacred. His speech was carefully controlled. His mistakes were believed to have consequences far beyond politics. When drought came, it was not blamed on chance. It was a sign of imbalance, a warning from the gods. War itself was not always about conquest. Often it was about capturing prisoners alive, feeding the rituals that kept the sun alive, at least in their understanding of the universe. Human sacrifice, so often reduced to horror alone, was part of a broader system of belief that fused survival, agriculture, astronomy, and fear of annihilation. The Mexica calculated time with extraordinary precision. They tracked planetary cycles, eclipses, and ritual calendars that intersected in ways still studied today. They believed previous worlds had ended in fire, flood, and darkness. Their own age was fragile. Every ceremony was a way of holding reality together just a little longer. But belief alone does not build an empire. The Aztecs expanded through strategic alliances and relentless warfare. Conquered cities were not always destroyed. Instead, they were folded into a tribute system that funneled food, labor, textiles, and luxury goods into Tenochtitlan. Resistance was met with force. Compliance was rewarded with protection and trade. This system made the capital extraordinarily wealthy, but it also created deep resentment. Entire regions waited for a chance to break free, watching carefully for weakness. That weakness arrived on the eastern coast, in the form of floating mountains with white wings. The arrival of the Spanish was not immediately seen as an apocalypse. They were strange, dangerous, but few. They depended heavily on indigenous allies, translators, and local knowledge just to survive. Hernán Cortés could not have marched inland without the support of people who hated the Aztecs more than they feared the unknown. The empire's greatest strength, its web of control, became its greatest vulnerability. Then came disease. Smallpox reached the Valley of Mexico before the Spanish fully returned to the city. It killed without discrimination. Warriors, farmers, priests, and rulers died in staggering numbers. The Emperor Cuitlahuac ruled for only a few months before the sickness took him. Bodies filled houses. The living could not bury the dead fast enough. Leadership fractured at the worst possible moment. When the final siege began, the city was already wounded. As the Spanish and their allies cut the aqueducts, fresh water disappeared. As they destroyed chinampas, food production collapsed. Canoes once filled with maize and beans now carried the injured. People drank from the lake and fell ill. Mothers gave children water that slowly killed them. Even so, resistance continued. Street by street, bridge by bridge, the Mexica fought with a determination shaped by generations of discipline and belief. They were not fighting only for land, they were fighting for the continuation of the world as they understood it. When Cuauhtémoc was captured, dragged from the water as he tried to escape by canoe, an empire effectively ended. Temples were dismantled stone by stone. Sacred objects were melted down. The city was rebuilt into something new, something foreign, on top of the bones of the old. But endings are rarely clean. Survivors adapted. Languages survived in whispers. Farming techniques continued to feed the land. Memory endured where monuments could not. Standing at this moment of collapse, surrounded by smoke and silence, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The fall of the Aztecs was not a simple story of conquest. It was the result of centuries of choices, beliefs, innovations, and pressures converging in a single devastating moment. And as the sun rises over a broken city, the question lingers quietly in the air. If survival shaped everything they became, what might it reveal about the choices they made long before the flames ever appeared? Long before the island city rose from the lake, before stone temples and causeways stitched water into land, the Mexica were a people without a home. Their story begins not with power, but with movement, with walking, with waiting, with hunger that stretched across generations. They spoke of a distant place called Aztlán, a homeland remembered more through story than certainty, where they were once surrounded by water and birds in abundance. Whether Aztlán existed as a physical place or a shared memory shaped by loss no longer matters. What matters is that they believed they had been commanded to leave, guided by a god who demanded endurance before reward. They traveled southward for decades, perhaps longer. Families carried children, bundles of maize, obsidian blades, and sacred objects wrapped in cloth. Elders carried stories. Priests carried calendars and signs, watching the sky for meaning. They crossed deserts where water vanished for days, forests where enemies hid behind unfamiliar trees, and valleys already claimed by city-states who wanted nothing to do with wandering outsiders. At every stop, the same pattern repeated: temporary settlement, rising tension, expulsion. The Mexica learned early that survival depended not on kindness from others, but on their own cohesion. They were often hired as mercenaries, their reputation growing sharper with each conflict. They fought fiercely, but their victories brought fear rather than welcome. Other groups tolerated them only as long as they were useful. When usefulness ended, so did hospitality. The Mexica adapted. They accepted insult without forgetting it. They learned the terrain, the politics, and the weaknesses of those around them. This long period of wandering forged a worldview shaped by impermanence. Nothing was guaranteed. Stability had to be earned, defended, and constantly renewed. Their god, Huitzilopochtli, was not gentle. He demanded obedience and sacrifice, not comfort. He promised a future, but never a smooth path. Through priests and omens, he told them to keep moving, to endure humiliation, to wait for a sign that would mark the end of exile. That sign would come in a place no one else wanted, a place where others saw death. The Mexico would see destiny. By the time they reached the Valley of Mexico, it was already crowded with powerful city-states. Lake Texcoco dominated the region, surrounded by fertile land and established cultures with deep histories. The Mexica arrived as latecomers with no land claim, no noble lineage recognized by others, and a reputation for brutality. They were pushed to the edges, settling briefly in places like Chapultepec, where they were again driven out after conflicts with their neighbors. Each defeat reinforced a lesson. To survive, they would need more than strength. They would need legitimacy. They began adopting customs from those around them, learning language variations, marriage alliances, and ritual practices. They did not abandon their identity. They layered it. Over time, they claimed descent from prestigious lineages, weaving themselves into the noble histories of the region. This was not deception in their eyes. It was survival through adaptation. If power respected tradition, then tradition could be learned. Eventually, they were permitted to settle on a small, swampy island in the western part of the lake. The land was unstable, mosquito-filled, and prone to flooding. Other peoples believed the Mexica would starve or sink into the mud. The permission to settle there was less an act of generosity than a quiet sentence. But the Mexica accepted without complaint. Their priests watched closely for signs, and then, according to their tradition, it happened. They saw an eagle perched on a cactus, holding a snake in its beak. For them, this was not metaphor. It was instruction. This was the place they had been promised, not because it was easy, but because it demanded transformation. They named it Tenochtitlán and began building with whatever they could find. Reeds, mud, wood, stone, carried by canoe. They drove stakes into the lake bed, layered soil, and created ground where none had existed. Every structure was an act of defiance against nature itself. Life on the island was harsh at first. Flooding destroyed early homes, storms tore through unfinished buildings, fresh water was scarce, but necessity sharpened ingenuity. They expanded chinampas, turning shallow water into some of the most productive farmland in the world. They learned to control water flow, separating brackish lake water from fresh springs. What had been a death sentence became an advantage. The lake protected them from attack, while feeding them through trade and agriculture. Social structure hardened alongside the city. Discipline became sacred. Children were trained to endure cold, hunger, and labor. Education was universal, with separate schools for nobles and commoners, both emphasizing duty over comfort. Boys learned warfare and restraint. Girls learned household management, weaving, and ritual responsibility. Everyone had a place. Disorder was not merely inefficient, it was dangerous. Religion tied these systems together. The Mexica believed they lived in the fifth sun, an age destined to end like the four before it. Earthquakes, famine, and darkness were not accidents. They were warnings. To delay the end, humans had obligations. Blood nourished the sun, ritual maintained balance. This belief did not emerge suddenly. It grew from generations of instability, where survival always felt temporary. When the world has nearly ended for your ancestors more than once, the idea that it could end again feels less like superstition and more like memory. As Tenochtitlan grew, so did confidence. The Mexica shifted from tolerated outsiders to indispensable allies. They proved themselves in battle, earning respect through effectiveness rather than affection. Their warriors captured enemies rather than killing them outright, feeding both ritual needs and political leverage. Their city became a center of trade, attracting merchants who carried not only goods, but information. Slowly, quietly, the balance of power changed. Yet even as they rose, the memory of wandering never fully disappeared. It lived in their myths, their ceremonies, their emphasis on vigilance. Stability was never assumed. Every drought, every omen, every strange event was taken seriously. The empire that would one day dominate millions was built by people who remembered what it meant to have nothing. When the Mexica finally stood at the center of the Valley of Mexico, They did so with the weight of their past pressing constantly against their present. Their strength came from adaptation. Their rigidity came from fear of collapse. These contradictions would shape everything that followed, for better and for worse. And as their city expanded outward, drawing others into its orbit, a quiet question remained beneath the stone and ceremony. When a people build their identity around survival itself, what happens when survival no longer feels enough? The city does not announce itself with walls or towers rising from dry land. It emerges from water. As you approach Tenochtitlán by canoe, the lake opens to reveal stone causeways stretching toward the horizon, lined with markers and watchposts. The city appears to float, its temples reflecting in the water, its movement constant and deliberate. Canoes glide past carrying flowers, maize, firewood, and people moving with purpose. This is not chaos built on mud. It is order imposed on an environment that resisted it at every turn. Tenochtitlan was engineered before it was monumental. The Mexica understood early that survival on a lake required control, not dominance. They separated fresh water from salt by constructing dikes that redirected flow without stopping it. Springs from the mainland fed aqueducts that carried clean water into the city in twin channels, allowing one to be cleaned while the other remained in use. Waste was collected daily and reused as fertilizer. Nothing was accidental. Every system fed another. The Chinampas extended outward like green veins, artificial islands formed by driving stakes into the lake bed and layering them with mud, vegetation, and soil. Trees anchored their edges, their roots holding everything in place. These floating farms produced maize, beans, squash, chilies, and flowers year-round. Multiple harvests were possible because the lake moderated temperature and nourished the soil. Farmers worked quietly at dawn, poling canoes through narrow canals, tending crops that fed a city larger than any in Europe at the time. Hunger, once a constant companion, became a managed threat. At the heart of the city stood the ceremonial precinct, dominated by the Templo Mayor. Its twin staircases rose side by side, one dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, the other to Tlaloc, the god of rain and fertility. This pairing was not symbolic alone. It reflected balance. War brought captives for ritual. Rain brought crops for survival. Both were necessary. Beneath the temple, layers of earlier structures lay buried, each one built over the last, a physical record of renewal rather than replacement. Daily life followed strict rhythms. Markets operated on fixed schedules, with the great market at Tlatelolco drawing tens of thousands of people. Judges monitored transactions, ensuring weights were fair and disputes settled immediately. Merchants known as Pochteka traveled far beyond the empire's borders, gathering intelligence as much as goods. They dressed modestly, spoke carefully, and remembered everything they saw. Their reports shaped military campaigns and diplomatic decisions long before armies moved. Education was compulsory. Children were taught discipline from an early age. Nobles attended Kalmakak schools, studying history, astronomy, ritual, and governance. Commoners attended Telpuchkali, learning warfare, civic duty, and physical endurance. Laziness was punished. Excess was discouraged. The goal was not comfort, but reliability. In a city built on water, failure of discipline could mean collapse. The social order was rigid, but not entirely closed. Exceptional warriors could rise in status through captured enemies. Merit mattered, but always within structure. Clothing signaled rank. Speech was formalized. Even posture conveyed meaning. The emperor was expected to embody restraint, humility, and vigilance. Public intoxication was punished severely. Private indulgence was tolerated only within boundaries. The message was clear. The individual existed within the system, not above it. Religion permeated everything, but it was practical as well as spiritual. Ritual calendars aligned agricultural cycles with celestial movements. Ceremonies prepared communities psychologically for drought, flood, or war. When rain failed, children were sometimes sacrificed to Tlaloc, their tears believed to summon storms. These acts were not carried out lightly. They were framed as necessary, painful duties to prevent far greater suffering. To modernize, this logic feels distant and disturbing. To the Mexica, It was an extension of responsibility in a world that felt perpetually unstable. As the city expanded, alliances became essential. Tenochtitlan did not rule alone. It formed the Triple Alliance with Texcoco and Tlacopan, combining military force and political legitimacy. Tribute flowed inward: food, textiles, jade, cacao, feathers, and labor. Conquered cities retained local rulers, but under constant oversight. Rebellion was punished publicly and decisively. The empire did not seek to erase identity, it sought compliance. Yet beneath the efficiency lay tension. Tribute demands grew heavier as the capital expanded. Religious obligations intensified. Warfare became more frequent. Captives were needed not only for political dominance, but to sustain cosmic balance as understood by the priesthood. The system fed itself, growing stronger and more brittle at the same time. Success narrowed options. Expansion became necessity rather than choice. Still, for those living within the city at its height, Tenochtitlan was a place of opportunity and order. Artisans crafted intricate stonework and feather mosaics that shimmered like living color. Poets composed verses about flowers and impermanence, aware that beauty was fleeting. Families gathered at dusk as the lake reflected the fading light, unaware of how often that same water would later carry destruction. The Mexica had achieved what once seemed impossible. They turned exile into dominance, mud into marble, hunger into abundance. Their city stood as proof that human ingenuity could reshape even the most unwelcoming landscape. And yet, as the Chinampas expanded and the temples rose higher, an unspoken question followed every success. When a civilization builds itself by mastering nature and fear alike, how does it recognize the moment when mastery begins to demand more than it can afford to give? Power does not arrive all at once. It settles gradually, almost quietly, until the weight of it begins to reshape everything beneath it. For the Mexica, dominance came not from a single conquest, but from a system refined over years of war, negotiation, and careful intimidation. By the time surrounding city-states fully understood what Tenochtitlan had become, the empire's reach was already woven into their daily survival. War was central, but it followed rules that outsiders often misunderstood. Battles were not always fought to annihilate, many were fought to capture. A living enemy had value far beyond a dead one. Captives fed ritual obligations, reinforced political hierarchy, and proved individual bravery. Warriors advanced in rank not by killing, but by taking prisoners alive. This shaped how battles unfolded. Combat was personal, disciplined, and intensely ritualized. Armor and weapons were designed to wound and disable rather than destroy. Courage mattered more than speed. Restraint mattered more than rage. Young men trained for years before entering combat. They learned to move in formation, to recognize signals, to retreat without shame if commanded. Cowardice was punished, but reckless behavior was also condemned. A warrior who broke formation endangered everyone. War was not chaos. It was choreography. The empire expanded through calculated campaigns, absorbing city-states across the Valley of Mexico and beyond. Once defeated, a city was not erased. Its temples remained. Its rulers often kept their positions. But tribute was imposed with precision. Maize, beans, cotton, cacao, feathers, jade, salt, and labor flowed steadily toward the capital. Records were kept using pictographic codices, each symbol marking obligation and compliance. Failure to deliver tribute was treated not as rebellion, but as betrayal of cosmic order. This system made the capital extraordinarily wealthy, but it also spread quiet resentment across the empire. Entire regions labored to support rituals they did not believe in, sacrifices that did not serve their gods, and wars that did not protect them. They complied because resistance brought destruction, but compliance did not bring loyalty. The empire was strong, but it was not deeply loved. Within the city, daily life reflected both abundance and pressure. Farmers rose before dawn to tend chinampas. Merchants traveled for months at a time, risking ambush and illness. Artisans worked under strict guild systems, their creations feeding ritual demand as much as aesthetic desire. Priests lived under intense expectation, fasting, bleeding themselves, and memorizing complex calendars to ensure ceremonies aligned with celestial cycles. Mistakes were believed to invite disaster. Sacrifice intensified as the empire grew. Major temple dedications required thousands of captives. These events were public, solemn, and structured. Victims were often treated with respect beforehand, fed well, dressed carefully, and reminded of the honor attached to their role. This did not erase the brutality, but it reveals a mindset shaped by fear of annihilation rather than cruelty alone. The Mexica believed the sun itself could fail. If it did, everything ended. No harvest, no future, no memory. Women played crucial roles often overlooked. They managed households, markets, and textile production, which was a major economic engine. Midwives were revered, guiding life into the world with ritual precision. Some women served as priestesses, keepers of tradition and ceremony. Others followed armies, providing logistical support. Strength was not defined by the battlefield alone. At the top stood the emperor, the Tlatoani, chosen not solely by birth, but by demonstrated leadership. He was expected to be a warrior, a diplomat, and a moral example. His public life was heavily restricted. He ate modestly, spoke formally, and participated in rituals that reinforced humility. His failures were believed to affect the entire empire. When drought struck or defeat occurred, responsibility settled squarely on his shoulders. As tribute increased and rituals multiplied, the system demanded constant expansion. Captives were needed. Resources were needed. Fear became a tool, but also a liability. The empire's dominance relied on momentum. Stopping meant collapse. And beneath the grandeur of festivals and victories, there was an unspoken awareness that the balance they maintained was fragile. Poets of the time wrote often about impermanence. Flowers bloomed and withered, songs faded into silence. Even stone crumbled. These were not idle thoughts. They were reminders. Power was temporary. Life was borrowed. The empire stood tall, but it stood on belief, discipline, and fear woven tightly together. As the Mexica reached the height of their influence, controlling millions of lives and vast territories, they appeared unstoppable. Yet every system built on constant expansion carries a hidden cost. And as their demands grew heavier and their enemies more watchful, one quiet question lingered beneath the drums and ceremonies. When an empire depends on perpetual conquest to sustain the universe itself, what happens the moment conquest becomes impossible? The city is at its most beautiful just before the balance begins to fail. The lake glows at dawn, reflecting temples painted in red, blue, and white. Canoes move in steady lines, bringing flowers for offerings, maize for grinding, and tribute from distant provinces. Drums echo softly from the ceremonial precinct as priests prepare the day's rituals. This is the Mexica world at its peak, ordered, confident, and convinced of its place at the center of existence. Before we go any further into this turning point, there is something that needs to be said quietly but honestly. If you have not subscribed to this channel yet, now is the moment. These long, slow histories take time to research and tell, and without your support, this channel will disappear, and stories like this will stop being told. If you want these voices from the past to keep speaking, your subscription is what keeps them alive. At the height of its power, the Aztec Empire ruled over millions of people across central Mexico. Tribute flowed into Tenochtitlán in quantities so vast that storehouses overflowed. Cotton from the warm lowlands, cacao beans used as currency, obsidian, sharper than steel, turquoise, jade, rubber, salt, and food arrived daily. The capital became not only a political center, but an economic and spiritual engine that sustained the empire's rhythm. Yet beneath this abundance, tension was everywhere. The empire was not a single united people. It was a collection of conquered cities, each with its own gods, traditions, and grievances. Many paid tribute grudgingly. Some did so only because rebellion meant annihilation. The Mexica understood this and responded with displays of power meant to discourage resistance. Public ceremonies grew larger. Sacrifices became more frequent. The message was unmistakable. The empire was strong, and the gods demanded obedience. The ruler at this moment was Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, known today as Moctezuma II. He was experienced, deeply religious, and highly educated. Unlike earlier rulers who had risen through battlefield achievement, Moctezuma embodied ceremonial authority. He expanded court ritual, emphasized divine order, and tightened social hierarchies. Nobles were elevated further above commoners. Access to the emperor became restricted. Even high-ranking officials approached him barefoot, eyes lowered, voices controlled. This shift was not weakness. It was Moctezuma's attempt to stabilize an empire that was growing too fast. He believed stricter ritual and clearer hierarchy would reinforce cosmic balance. But it also created distance. The ruler became less visible, more symbolic, and harder to question. Decisions flowed downward, but dissent had nowhere to go. Omens began to circulate. A comet appeared in the sky. A temple caught fire without apparent cause. The lake rose unexpectedly, flooding parts of the city. A woman was said to wander at night, weeping for her children. These were not dismissed as coincidence. In Mexico thought, the universe spoke through signs. Something was shifting. Far away, along the eastern coast, strangers arrived. At first, news traveled slowly through merchant networks and coastal allies. Floating structures larger than any canoe, men with skin like pale clay, animals that carried humans on their backs, weapons that thundered and killed at a distance. The reports were confused, contradictory, and unsettling. Some thought the newcomers were gods, others thought they were demons. Many simply thought they were dangerous. Moctezuma listened. He sent emissaries carrying gifts, gold, feathers, and cloth, hoping to learn intentions without provoking conflict. The gifts had the opposite effect. To the Spanish, they looked like proof of immense wealth. To Moctezuma, they were diplomatic gestures meant to establish boundaries. Two worlds speaking entirely different languages of power. Within the empire, resentment deepened. Cities like Tlaxcala, long enemies of the Mexica, watched closely. They had resisted conquest for years, paying for their independence with constant warfare. Now they saw opportunity. The arrival of the Spanish did not feel like invasion to them. It felt like leverage. Meanwhile, disease began to move invisibly. Smallpox arrived ahead of armies, carried by people who did not understand what they carried. It spread through communities with no immunity. Fever, blisters, blindness, death. Entire households vanished within weeks. Priests performed rituals. Healers applied traditional remedies. Nothing worked. The gods were silent. Inside Tenochtitlán, daily life continued, but anxiety crept into everything. Ritual calendars grew crowded, with ceremonies meant to restore balance. Captives were sacrificed in greater numbers. The pressure to sustain the sun intensified. The system demanded more, at the very moment the empire's foundations were weakening. Moctezuma faced an impossible position. If he attacked the Spanish too early, he risked cosmic imbalance and political backlash. If he welcomed them, he risked losing control. He chose caution. He invited them into the city, believing diplomacy and ritual authority could contain the threat. It was a decision shaped by belief, not ignorance. He believed the universe rewarded restraint. When the Spanish entered Tenochtitlan, they were astonished. The city surpassed anything they had imagined. Clean streets, orderly markets, waterways alive with movement. But awe quickly mixed with calculation. They took Moctezuma hostage within his own palace, using him as a symbol to control the city. Authority cracked. The emperor still lived, but his power was compromised. For the Mexica, this was unprecedented. The Tlatoani was sacred. To see him restrained was to witness cosmic disorder made physical. Trust eroded. Anger spread. When violence finally erupted, it did so with ferocity born of humiliation and fear. The empire that had mastered survival now faced something it could not ritualize away. Steel, alliances forged from resentment, and disease, indifferent to belief, pressed inward from every direction. The balance they had maintained for generations was failing, not because they lacked intelligence or courage, but because the world had changed in ways their systems were never designed to absorb. As the city stood glittering on the lake, still feeding millions, still praying for the sun to rise. The question was no longer whether the Mexica were powerful. The question was whether power built on fear, belief, and expansion could adapt fast enough to survive a threat that followed none of their rules. And as Moctezuma looked out across his city, surrounded by signs he could not ignore, did he already sense that the moment of choice had passed? Night falls differently over a city under siege. The sounds change first. The market quiets. Canoes stop moving. Drums no longer echo in rhythm, but in warning. By the time the Spanish return to Tenochtitlan in force, the lake has become a battlefield, and the empire is already bleeding from wounds no ceremony can close. After Moctezuma's death, authority fractures. Some say he was struck by stones thrown by his own people when he tried to calm them. Others believe the Spanish killed him when he no longer served their purpose. What matters more than how he died is what his death represented. The sacred center failed. The emperor, once the axis between gods and humans, was gone. In a society built on ritual continuity, this rupture was catastrophic. Cuitlahuac rose briefly, leading fierce resistance and driving the Spanish from the city in what later became known as the Night of Sorrows. Spanish soldiers drowned under the weight of stolen gold. Causeways became killing grounds. For a moment, it seemed the Mexica might survive after all, but victory was short-lived. Smallpox claimed Cuitlahuac within months. Leadership passed again, this time to Cuauhtemoc, young, determined, and inheriting a city already starving. The Spanish did not return alone. They came with tens of thousands of indigenous allies, including Tlaxcalans, who had suffered under Mexica dominance for generations. This was not a simple clash between two worlds. It was a civil war layered onto invasion. Old grievances found an outlet. Cities that once paid tribute now marched against the capital. The siege tightened slowly. Brigantines built on the lake cut off canoe traffic. Causeways were destroyed section by section. Aqueducts were severed. Fresh water vanished. Chinampas were burned. The systems that had sustained the city now worked against it. The lake trapped rather than protected. Hunger spread faster than fear. Inside Tenochtitlan, survival became improvisation. People boiled weeds, chewed leather, scraped algae from stones. Parents gave children water they knew might kill them. Disease returned in waves. Still, resistance continued. Warriors fought from rooftops, from canals, from behind shattered walls. Women carried stones and supplies. Priests continued rituals even as temples burned. Belief did not vanish. It hardened. Cuauhtemoc refused surrender. He organized defenses, repaired breaches, and inspired those still able to fight. He understood the city could not win, but survival had never guaranteed victory. It demanded endurance. When capture finally came, it was not from weakness, but from exhaustion. He was taken while trying to escape across the lake, seized and brought before Cortés. The fall of Tenochtitlan did not end suffering. It transformed it. Temples were dismantled, idols destroyed, codices burned. Survivors were forced into labor rebuilding the city as a colonial capital. The lake was drained, canals filled, the island became land. The world the Mexica had shaped was systematically erased in stone, but not entirely in memory. Languages survived in kitchens and markets. Farming techniques fed future generations. Names endured in place. And people, the conquerors recorded their version of events, but indigenous voices persisted through oral history, fragments of codices, and archaeology that still reveals complexity beneath the ruins. The Aztecs did not fall because they were primitive. They fell because their systems, brilliant as they were, could not adapt fast enough to a threat that combined unfamiliar technology, internal resentment, and biological catastrophe. Their story is not one of simple defeat, but of resilience under impossible pressure. As dawn rises over the ruins of Tenochtitlan, smoke clears to reveal a transformed landscape. What once floated now sinks. What once ruled now adapts. The people remain, reshaping themselves again, just as they had during their long migration centuries earlier. And as the city's stones are repurposed into something new, one final question lingers in the quiet. When a civilization survives its own ending, where does its true legacy begin? Long after the final fires burned out, the violence did not truly end. It changed shape. The fall of Tenochtitlan was loud, but what followed was quieter and, in many ways, more devastating. Survival now meant learning to live inside a world rebuilt by others, on terms never chosen. The Spanish moved quickly to erase what they feared and misunderstood. Temples were dismantled stone by stone, their blocks reused to build churches, palaces, and government buildings. The Templo Mayor disappeared beneath layers of colonial construction, its sacred heart buried but not forgotten. Idols were smashed publicly. Priests were executed or forced into hiding. Codices, painted with centuries of history, astronomy, and law, were burned in fires meant to cleanse memory itself. Yet destruction did not mean disappearance. The Mexica, who survived, adapted as they always had. They learned Spanish words while preserving Nahuatl in their homes. They attended Christian services while quietly remembering old rituals tied to planting and harvest. They reshaped their gods into saints, their festivals into new calendars. Survival once again demanded flexibility. Disease continued to ravage the population. Smallpox was followed by measles, typhus, and influenza. Entire communities vanished. The valley that once supported millions was reduced to a fraction of its former population within a few decades. Fields lay abandoned, canals filled with debris. Labor shortages reshaped everything. The Spanish needed workers, and survivors were forced into systems of encomienda, labor obligations that tied indigenous communities to colonial masters under the promise of protection and conversion. Cuauhtémoc, the last emperor, became a symbol of defiance, even in defeat. He was tortured in an attempt to extract the location of gold. He gave nothing. Years later, he was executed during an expedition far from his homeland, accused of plotting rebellion. His death marked the final removal of Mexican political authority, but it also sealed his legacy as a figure of endurance rather than surrender. Everyday life became an exercise in quiet resistance. Farmers continued to use Chinampa techniques where possible, feeding cities that no longer remembered who had invented them. Women preserved language, recipes, and rituals through domestic life. Midwives blended indigenous knowledge with imposed beliefs. Elders told stories selectively, knowing which memories could be shared and which had to be guarded. The Spanish rewrote history quickly. Chronicles described the Aztecs as cruel, backward, obsessed with blood. These accounts justified conquest and conversion, but archaeology and indigenous records tell a more complex story. They reveal a society deeply concerned with order, balance, and survival in an unpredictable world. A civilization that understood impermanence long before it experienced its own destruction. Even the land itself resisted forgetting. As Mexico City expanded, floods plagued the colonial capital. Draining the lake removed natural protections the Mexica had carefully engineered. What was once dismissed as primitive suddenly revealed itself as sophisticated. The conquerors struggled with problems the conquered had already solved centuries earlier. In time, the descendants of the Mexica would help shape a new identity, one neither fully indigenous nor fully European. Language, food, and belief blended into something enduring. Maize remained central. Nahuatl words slipped into everyday speech. Place names refused replacement. The past persisted, not as monuments, but as foundation. The Aztec story does not end with collapse. It continues through survival, adaptation, and quiet continuity. Their resilience was never about winning. It was about enduring long enough to be remembered, even when memory itself was under attack. As centuries passed and the world above their ruins changed again and again, the legacy of the Mexica remained embedded in the land, the language, and the lives built atop their city. And as we uncover their story piece by piece, a final thought rises from beneath the stone. When a civilization is forced to survive invisibly, how do we measure the strength it takes simply to remain? Time does not erase an empire all at once. It softens edges, rearranges meaning, and leaves fragments behind for those willing to look closely. Generations after the conquest, the Mexica world still breathed beneath the surface of the colonial city, quiet but persistent, shaping lives in ways even its conquerors could not fully control. Children grew up speaking Nahuatl at home and Spanish in public. They learned prayers taught by priests, but their grandparents whispered older stories at night, careful with words, careful with memory. The gods were no longer named openly, yet their presence lingered in agricultural rhythms, in reverence for mountains, rain, and maize. Survival no longer required warfare or tribute, it required silence, patience, and endurance of a different kind. Colonial rule reshaped the valley dramatically. The Spanish drained the lake to control flooding, believing water to be an enemy rather than a partner. The result was instability. Floods became more destructive. Disease spread through stagnant canals. The carefully balanced ecosystem the Mexica had engineered collapsed. What had once fed millions struggled to sustain far fewer. Ironically, the conquerors suffered from the loss of systems they never understood. Indigenous labor built the new city. Stones from temples formed the foundations of cathedrals. Roads followed ancient causeways. Markets reappeared in familiar locations. Even as rulers changed, geography remembered. The old city never truly vanished. It was layered over, not removed. Some indigenous nobles navigated the new order with strategic intelligence. They learned Spanish law, petitioned colonial courts, and documented land claims using hybrid records, combining European writing with indigenous pictographs. These documents survive today, evidence of a people who refused to disappear quietly. Resistance was no longer open rebellion. It was persistence through adaptation. Centuries later, archaeologists would uncover the buried remains of the Templo Mayor beneath modern streets. Each discovery revealed the sophistication that had been dismissed for so long. Sculptures, offerings, and layers of construction told a story of renewal rather than savagery. Slowly, the narrative began to shift. The Aztecs were no longer just conquerors or victims. They were engineers, philosophers, poets, and survivors. Modern Mexico still carries their imprint. Maize remains central to identity. Nahuatl words describe daily life. Festivals echo ancient calendars. The past is not distant. It is embedded. The Aztecs did not survive as an empire, but they survived as a people, reshaping themselves again and again as history demanded. Their story challenges simple endings. It asks us to reconsider what it means for a civilization to fall. Is collapse measured by lost power or by lost memory? And if a culture continues to shape the world long after its rulers vanish, can we truly say it ever ended at all? The arrival of the Spanish was not only a military confrontation, it was a collision of worlds. One carried centuries of ritual, language, and cosmology. The other, steel, horses, and germs invisible to the eye, but lethal in impact. For the Mexica, these foreigners were at once awe-inspiring and terrifying. Horses thundered where none had existed. Cannons roared like the gods themselves in fury. Armor reflected sunlight in ways that seemed magical. Yet it was not magic that threatened Tenochtitlán, it was calculation, adaptation, and circumstance converging with deadly effect. Cortés advanced strategically, but he relied as much on diplomacy and indigenous allies as on brute force. Tlaxcalans, Otomi, and other groups had suffered under Mexican dominance and now saw opportunity in aligning with outsiders. For the Aztecs, enemies were familiar. What they faced now was not. They had no blueprint for negotiation with men who arrived on unknown animals, wielding unfamiliar weapons, and promising allegiance to a distant king. Their rituals, built over centuries to control their universe, could not account for disease, deceit, and firearms. Moctezuma's approach was cautious. He sent emissaries bearing gold, feathers, and food, gifts meant to establish respect and maintain cosmic balance. The Spanish interpreted them differently as proof of wealth to be seized. When Moctezuma finally welcomed them into Tenochtitlan, he believed in diplomacy and ritual as shields. They became chains. The sacred emperor, meant to embody divine order, was reduced to hostage. His authority fractured, and with it, the city's social cohesion began to crumble. Inside the city, anxiety spread. People whispered of omens, comets streaking across the sky, temples struck by lightning, unexplained fires. Each anomaly was interpreted as warning, but the frequency of disasters exceeded the explanatory power of even the most learned priests. Disease smallpox arrived quietly, carried along trade and communication routes. It struck first in outlying regions, then spread rapidly through the densely populated city. Entire households vanished within days. Children, elders, warriors, all succumbed. Rituals continued, but their efficacy seemed hollow against an invisible enemy. The city's defenses, which had once relied on geography, engineering, and disciplined warriors, were challenged in unexpected ways. Floating brigantines cut supply lines along the lake. Causeways, designed to facilitate trade and movement, became traps. The population faced starvation as food deliveries slowed and the chinampas burned. Even as resistance continued, the city's energy drained with every passing week. Survival was still possible, but it required endurance that tested the limits of both body and belief. Cuauhtémoc, the young ruler, embodied this struggle. He coordinated defenses, repaired breaches, and inspired fighters despite overwhelming odds. Every action reflected the Mexica tradition of discipline, ingenuity, and ritual responsibility. Yet even the most extraordinary endurance could not offset disease, starvation, and the combined forces of Spanish weaponry and indigenous allies. The siege transformed daily life into an exercise in desperation. Water contaminated by corpses spread illness. Mothers gave children what little remained, knowing some would die. Warriors fought street by street, rooftop by rooftop, behind barricades improvised from the debris of a city under relentless assault. Priests performed ceremonies even as their temples burned, maintaining belief as a shield against despair. Human resilience reached both its physical and psychological limits. Ultimately, Cuauhtémoc was captured while attempting to flee across the lake. The city surrendered not only to an army, but to a combination of biological, social, and logistical pressures no single strategy could repel. Tenochtitlán, brilliant, disciplined, and seemingly invincible, fell in a matter of months. But the story did not end with bricks and blood. Survivors adapted, merging old knowledge with imposed structures, preserving culture quietly even under colonial surveillance. Even today, Tenochtitlán's imprint endures. The city's canals, marketplaces, and urban logic inform modern Mexico City. Agricultural techniques, particularly chinampas, are studied and revived. Language, tradition, and memory persist in neighborhoods, festivals, and domestic life. The Mexica's survival was not in empire, but in adaptation, shaping the world quietly from beneath colonial ruins. As we reflect on this, one question persists. When a civilization confronts forces it cannot fully control, when belief, ingenuity, and courage collide with the unpredictable, what remains after the battle is over the empire, or its enduring influence on the world that outlives it. The siege of Tenochtitlan was unlike any battle the Mexica had ever faced. The city had been built to endure attacks. Its causeways could be cut, its canals navigated only by those who knew them, its walls reinforced with mud and stone, but nothing in their experience prepared them for the combination of enemies, disease, and isolation that now converged. The city, once alive with trade and ceremony, had become a labyrinth of desperation. Smoke from burning homes and temples curled into the sky. The sounds of drums, once rhythmic and ceremonial, now marked alarm and distress. Waterways, the lifeblood of the city, were blocked or contaminated. Hunger gnawed at everyone, from warriors to children, shaping every decision with urgency and fear. Cuauhtémoc, the young emperor, understood the stakes. He had inherited a city under siege, a population suffering from sickness, and an empire fractured by internal dissent. His position was as much symbolic as strategic. His people looked to him not merely for direction, but for reassurance that the gods had not abandoned them. He organized defensive positions along the causeways, strengthened barricades, and directed the movement of supplies and reinforcements. Every alley, canal, and rooftop became a front line. Despite the chaos, the Mexica fought with a discipline born of centuries of survival. Even in desperation, strategy remained crucial. The Spanish and their indigenous allies approached the siege methodically. Brigantines were constructed on Lake Texcoco to cut off canoe traffic, severing supply lines and isolating Tenochtitlan from the surrounding territories. The lake, once a protective barrier, had become a prison. Artillery and firearms, unfamiliar and devastating, reshaped the city's defensive strategies. The Mexica had never faced weapons capable of killing from a distance, and their warriors adapted quickly, using canals, rooftops, and ambushes to counter the threat. Yet every adaptation came with cost. Every hour of resistance depleted energy, resources, and morale. Hunger, perhaps more than weapons, began to dictate the course of the siege. Chinampas, previously abundant sources of food, were burned or rendered inaccessible. Aqueducts, the engineering marvels that had supplied fresh water for centuries, were destroyed, leaving civilians and warriors alike to drink from the contaminated lake. Food rationing became extreme. People boiled weeds, scraped algae, and chewed bark to stave off starvation. Children, the most vulnerable, suffered disproportionately. Disease compounded the toll, spreading faster than any army could march. Smallpox, brought unknowingly by Europeans, devastated the population, killing tens of thousands in weeks. Its arrival was sudden, invisible, and merciless. Amid the siege, the social fabric of Tenochtitlan was tested. The Mexica had built a society structured around discipline, hierarchy, and ritual. Now, these systems were strained to the breaking point. Priests continued to conduct ceremonies, offering sacrifices and prayers to sustain cosmic balance. Warriors adhered to formations and strategies even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them. Families attempted to care for one another, improvising food and water distribution in the absence of central provisioning. Survival required coordination at every level, but coordination was made almost impossible by the sheer scale of death and disruption. Every street, every canal, became a theatre of both desperation and ingenuity. Women carried water to warriors, transported supplies along canals in canoes, and reinforced barricades. Children acted as messengers, weaving through streets under fire. Elderly citizens participated in ritual tasks that maintained psychological cohesion, ensuring that, even in despair, the community remained anchored by shared belief. Medicine men and healers applied traditional remedies to treat disease, often at great personal risk, even though these remedies were powerless against smallpox and other introduced illnesses. The psychological strain of the siege was immense. People lived in constant fear of attack, starvation, and disease, and morale fluctuated wildly. Some clung to ritual as a source of hope, while others expressed anger and despair at the seemingly unending crisis. Panic could erupt suddenly, leading to chaos in narrow streets where thousands were crowded together, yet remarkable resilience persisted. Stories survive of families who shared the last scraps of food, of warriors who fought beyond exhaustion, of priests who continued to uphold sacred duties despite the hopelessness around them. Cuauhtémoc himself exemplified this endurance. He moved between defensive positions, inspected barricades, and motivated warriors even while facing his own exhaustion and despair. Accounts describe him visiting neighborhoods to reassure civilians, rallying young warriors, and making strategic decisions in the face of near-impossible circumstances. His leadership was not infallible, but it was rooted in the same principles that had guided the Mexica for generations: discipline, strategic thinking, and belief in the cosmic order. Despite these efforts, the siege took a relentless toll. Mortality rates skyrocketed, not only among the vulnerable, but also among warriors actively defending the city. Each day, the city became more depopulated, streets and canals littered with the dead and dying. Sanitation collapsed. Disease spread more rapidly through weakened bodies. Food shortages worsened. The Mexica were confronting a multi-front crisis: enemy attacks, starvation, and a microscopic threat they could neither see nor combat. Interactions with the Spanish were marked by strategic calculation as well as desperation. Attempts at negotiation were made, both to buy time and to seek a reprieve from violence, but the Spanish viewed these overtures through a lens of conquest, not diplomacy. Every act of submission or gift could be interpreted as weakness or opportunity by either side. Misunderstandings compounded fear. Cultural and linguistic differences made negotiation treacherously complex. Each party interpreted the world according to its own beliefs, often clashing violently with the other. Even as the city weakened, the Mexica demonstrated remarkable tactical ingenuity. Barricades were repaired daily. Canoes moved food, weapons, and messages along hidden routes. Ambushes were set for isolated Spanish forces. Snipers on rooftops targeted officers. Waterways were used to trap or redirect enemy movements. Every advantage the Mexica could derive from their intimate knowledge of the terrain was exploited to its fullest. Yet these efforts, though brilliant, could not compensate for the combination of starvation, disease, and superior weaponry. Within the city, ordinary people endured unimaginable suffering. Mothers attempted to feed children with anything edible, sometimes boiling bark, leaves, or scraps of old maize. Families shared their last rations, knowing they might be insufficient to sustain life. Disease spread rapidly through overcrowded homes, where separation of the sick was impossible. Every day presented a choice between impossible options: eat or save for later, fight or hide, pray or despair. The final weeks of the siege were marked by incremental collapse. Causeways fell one by one. Fresh water became a rarity. Fires consumed neighborhoods, either intentionally to disrupt supply or as accidents born of desperation. The social and ritual structures that had long maintained cohesion were under extreme stress. Leadership was challenged both physically and morally, as decisions meant to save lives inevitably led to more suffering. Cuauhtémoc was eventually forced to recognize the limits of endurance. The final breaches of the city left the Mexica surrounded, their options exhausted. In a last attempt to escape, he took to a canoe across the lake, but was captured by the Spanish. His capture signaled not just the fall of a leader, but the near-total collapse of centralized resistance. The city surrendered in stages, with the surviving population forced to endure both physical and psychological subjugation. Even in defeat, the Mexica spirit persisted. Survivors adapted to the new order imposed by the Spanish. Knowledge of Chinampa, agriculture, urban planning, and social organization persisted, informing the colonial city in subtle ways. Language, ritual memory, and cultural practice survived in domestic spaces, markets, and festivals. While Tenochtitlan as a sovereign capital had fallen, its influence remained embedded in the people and the landscape. The siege demonstrates that the fall of an empire is rarely instantaneous or simple. It is the cumulative effect of military pressure, disease, starvation, internal divisions, and psychological strain. Tenochtitlan did not collapse because its people lacked courage or ingenuity. It fell because circumstances combined in a way no single strategy could overcome. And yet, even under the most extreme conditions, human resilience and adaptation persisted, leaving traces that would survive long after the city itself was transformed. As we consider the siege and its aftermath, a question emerges quietly but persistently. When an entire civilization is tested by forces beyond its control, when discipline, strategy, and belief are pushed to their absolute limits, what is the true measure of survival? The empire itself, or the persistence of its people, culture, and knowledge in the face of overwhelming odds? After the city fell, Tenochtitlan was no longer the proud island capital that had dazzled visitors with its canals, temples, and bustling markets. What remained was a landscape of smoke, ruin, and grief. Streets that once echoed with the rhythm of drums and trade were now filled with silence, punctuated only by the groans of the sick and the wails of those mourning the dead. The Mexican Valley, which had supported millions, was scarred, both physically and psychologically. And yet, the Mexica people, though defeated, persisted, adapting to a world reshaped by conquest. The Spanish began a systematic transformation of the city almost immediately. Temples were dismantled stone by stone, their materials repurposed to construct cathedrals, administrative buildings, and colonial residences. The Templo Mayor, the heart of Mexican religious life, was buried beneath layers of new construction. Each church and palace erected above the ruins served as a visual and symbolic reminder of the conquest, signaling the supremacy of the colonizers' faith and authority. Indigenous sacred spaces were overwritten, yet traces survived, buried deep beneath layers of stone, waiting centuries later to be rediscovered. Beyond architecture, the imposition of colonial order extended to labor and social organization. The surviving population faced the encomienda system, which forced indigenous communities to provide labor to Spanish settlers in exchange for supposed protection and religious instruction. Former warriors, artisans, and farmers were compelled to work fields, transport materials, and perform tasks for their conquerors. Life was now structured not by Mexica's social organization or ritual, but by Spanish decrees. Survival depended on navigating this new hierarchy, maintaining cultural memory secretly, and enduring exploitation with resilience. Disease, which had already devastated the population during the siege, continued to claim lives. Smallpox had already killed tens of thousands, and now other European illnesses, such as measles, influenza, and typhus, spread through the densely populated areas with catastrophic effect. Families were fractured, villages depopulated, and social cohesion weakened. The biological impact of the conquest was enormous. Entire lineages disappeared, and with them, knowledge, traditions, and skills. The Mexica had survived countless challenges during their migration and expansion, but this combination of violence and disease tested their endurance like never before. Even as the city was transformed, the Mexica found ways to preserve their culture. Language, ritual, and knowledge were passed down quietly through families. Nahuatl remained the language of home and market, even as Spanish dominated public and administrative life. Agricultural techniques, particularly the chinampas, persisted in adapted forms. Traditional festivals and rituals were reshaped to blend with Christian practices, creating a hybrid culture that allowed survival under oppressive circumstances. Memory became both shield and weapon. What could not be practiced openly was remembered privately, ready to re-emerge when circumstances allowed. Indigenous elites attempted to navigate this new world by learning Spanish law, petitioning colonial courts, and documenting land claims. Hybrid codices, combining European writing with pictographs, recorded legal ownership, tribute obligations, and family histories. These efforts preserved elements of Mexica political and social knowledge, even as the structures that had supported an empire were dismantled. Survival required adaptability as much as courage, and those who could combine old knowledge with new forms of power increased their chances of continuity. The psychological impact of the conquest and the siege cannot be overstated. Survivors carried trauma from the extreme violence, famine, and disease they had endured. Yet trauma was interwoven with resilience. Communities persisted by finding ways to maintain identity despite subjugation. Stories of heroes, ancestors, and sacred events were told quietly in homes and marketplaces, ensuring continuity of knowledge and values. Even the most devastating losses could not entirely erase the sense of identity forged over centuries. The land itself retained memory. Canals and causeways, though partially filled or repurposed, still shaped movement and settlement patterns. Agricultural innovations like chinampas influenced local food production for generations. Even the water systems, when partially restored, revealed the brilliance of the Mexica engineers to those willing to study them. Knowledge embedded in the landscape endured, waiting to be rediscovered by later generations. Cultural adaptation became a defining strategy. Rituals were transformed rather than abandoned. Sacred days were merged with Christian festivals. Deities were sometimes syncretized with saints. This allowed communities to retain spiritual continuity while outwardly conforming to colonial expectations. Survival, once tied to conquest, warfare, and tribute, was now tied to subtlety, discretion, and the careful preservation of knowledge. By the mid-16th century, Tenochtitlán had been largely rebuilt as Mexico City, the capital of New Spain. Yet beneath its streets lay the ruins of a civilization that had once commanded millions, engineered a city on water, and created a complex system of governance, agriculture, and belief. Archaeology and later scholarship revealed the sophistication that the conquerors had dismissed. Scholars, historians, and descendants recognized that the fall of the city did not erase the Mexica contribution to culture, urban design, and human ingenuity. Even centuries later, the Mexica legacy endures in modern Mexico. Place names, agricultural practices, language, festivals, and stories carry the imprint of a civilization that refused to vanish completely. The ingenuity and resilience that allowed a wandering people to build a floating city and sustain an empire continued to inform the lives of descendants, shaping a hybrid culture that bridged past and present. The collapse of Tenochtitlan is often framed as an ending, but it is more accurately a transformation. The empire ceased to exist politically, but its people endured. Knowledge survived in memory, practice, and adaptation. The landscape itself carried traces of their genius. When we study canals, chinampas, urban planning, and ritual structures, we glimpse not merely a fallen city, but a civilization whose influence continues quietly, deeply, and persistently. The ultimate question remains: when an empire is physically destroyed, when rulers are executed, and cities razed, what defines its survival? Is it the preservation of political power? Or is it the persistence of knowledge, culture, and human ingenuity in the face of overwhelming adversity? The Mexica endured not because they won battles, but because they adapted, remembered, and shaped the world in ways that would echo for centuries. Even after the fall of Tenochtitlan and the sweeping changes imposed by the Spanish, the spirit of the Mexica people persisted in subtle, often hidden ways. Survival had shifted from warfare and conquest to adaptation and memory. Generations learned to live under a new order while preserving the essence of their culture, weaving threads of the past into the fabric of a world dominated by foreign authority. The empire's collapse had not erased its knowledge, it had merely transformed the stage on which it would endure. Language was one of the most vital carriers of culture. Nahuatl, spoken in homes and markets across the valley, resisted replacement. While Spanish became the language of administration, law, and religion, Nahuatl flourished in everyday communication, storytelling, poetry, and ritual. Elders taught children through oral histories, conveying not only stories of gods and heroes, but also social norms, moral lessons, and survival knowledge accumulated over centuries. Phrases describing natural phenomena, farming techniques, and ceremonial timing carried embedded wisdom that remained relevant despite colonial disruption. Agriculture continued to anchor Mexica's resilience. Chinampas, the floating gardens that had once fed millions, persisted in smaller, localized forms. Farmers adapted their techniques to the altered lake and valley conditions, using ingenuity to maintain soil fertility and maximize yields. Crops like maize, beans, squash, and chilies continued to define diets, sustaining families and communities while connecting them to ancestral practices. The land itself, though transformed by drainage projects and urban expansion, bore silent testimony to the engineering mastery of a civilization that had thrived on water. Ritual life adapted rather than disappeared. Sacred days and festivals were merged with Catholic observances, creating a syncretic calendar that preserved elements of ancient belief under the guise of Christian tradition. Deities were reinterpreted as saints. Offerings became symbolic rather than literal in many cases. Even when public displays were curtailed by colonial authorities, private rituals maintained a sense of continuity, allowing communities to honor ancestors, mark seasonal cycles, and express spiritual obligations. Survival now required subtlety as much as devotion. Art and craft also preserved cultural memory. Techniques in weaving, pottery, and featherwork survived through apprenticeships and domestic production. Objects often carried dual significance, aesthetically pleasing to colonizers while maintaining indigenous symbolism recognizable to those in the know. Every woven pattern, every ceramic design became a repository of identity, telling stories about lineage, cosmology, and social roles. The creative spirit, once expressed in temples and palaces, adapted to homes, marketplaces, and hidden workshops. Music and oral poetry remained central to cultural endurance. Mexica songs, originally performed in ceremonial contexts, continued in daily life and domestic celebrations. Poetry, often metaphorical, preserved philosophical and moral ideas, recounting human ingenuity, the relationship to nature, and the importance of memory. Even as colonial authorities sought to suppress certain forms, these artistic expressions persisted, passed quietly from generation to generation. Education became a private endeavor. While formal Mexica schools were dismantled, knowledge was transmitted through family networks, apprenticeships, and community mentorship. Children learned farming techniques, religious stories, moral principles, and social norms from parents and elders. This informal education ensured the survival of essential knowledge, even as official curricula enforced Spanish language, religion, and worldview. Adaptation, once a necessity of migration and conquest, now ensured cultural continuity. Resistance persisted in subtle ways. While armed rebellion was largely impossible given colonial power and disease, the Mexica employed strategies of endurance and subversion. Land use practices preserved ancestral knowledge, storytelling maintained historical memory, and cultural ceremonies embedded in daily life retained indigenous identity. Each act of remembrance, each practice maintained quietly, was a form of survival, asserting continuity against attempts at erasure. Generations later, archaeology and scholarship would rediscover the sophistication of Tenochtitlan and the Mexica civilization. Excavations revealed the Templo Mayor, offering insight into architectural complexity, ceremonial design, and religious significance. Codices, preserved through both indigenous and colonial hands, documented governance, trade, tribute systems, and cosmology. These sources challenged early Spanish narratives that depicted the Mexica as barbaric, instead highlighting their intelligence, discipline, and adaptability. The empire's ingenuity had not vanished. It was merely obscured by conquest. Cultural survival also shaped identity in modern Mexico. Place names, culinary traditions, agricultural practices, and social customs retain the imprint of the Mexica. Maize-based dishes, markets patterned after pre-Hispanic systems, and even local calendars reflect enduring structures of knowledge. Descendants of the Mexica integrate these legacies into contemporary life, maintaining a living connection to a civilization that, though politically extinguished, continues to influence daily existence. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Mexica's survival reminds us that the end of an empire does not mean the disappearance of its people or knowledge. Political power may be lost, cities may fall, and rulers may die, but culture, language, ingenuity, and resilience can endure in ways less visible but no less powerful. The Mexica survived by adapting, remembering, and transmitting knowledge across centuries, ensuring that the lessons of their civilization could continue to shape human experience long after conquest. The ultimate reflection emerges from this endurance. When a civilization cannot prevent its political or military collapse, how do we measure its legacy? Is survival the continuation of empire, or the persistence of culture, knowledge, and identity? For the Mexica, the answer lies not in their fall, but in the threads of life, memory, and ingenuity woven quietly into generations that followed.